Alright, so in this lesson we're going to have a look at the transitional liberal philosopher Jeremy Bentham and his proposed philosophy of utilitarianism. We briefly went over some utilitarianism when we went over John Stuart Mill. So, Jeremy Bentham lived between 1748 and 1832. And as you likely already know, 1832, the year of the Great Reform Act. So, Bentham and the inception of utilitarianism. Bentham can be categorized as one of the developmental liberals of the 19th century, of the same species as John Stuart Mill, who sought to adapt classical liberal ideas to a society that was now much more urban and put far greater emphasis on ideas such as democracy and socialism. Actually, these socialist sympathies are better described as syndicalist movements in the modern political vernacular. So a syndicalist movement is more for workers' rights as opposed to any kind of Marxist underpinnings. So, Jeremy Bentham is remembered as the father of the philosophy known as utilitarianism. Utilitarianism proposed an apparently scientific alternative to natural rights theory, based on the notion that an individual should seek to maximize their own personal pleasure and minimize pain. Ergo, utilitarianism can be categorized as an offshoot of Epicurean Hedonism. Epicurus was a hedonist philosopher in ancient Greece. Bentham and the Transitional Liberal Philosophy. Bentham recognized that in an industrialized society, this would create clashes between individuals and the different classes due to a conflict of interests. As a means to ensure this greatest happiness of the greatest number, a quote from Joseph Priestley, Bentham believed that the liberal state had to become more proactive, utilizing hedonic calculus to inform legislation. So this is a transition from the classical liberal idea of a night watchman state, because now they're talking about more state intervention to solve problems. So that's why it's kind of considered developmental liberalism, because it's between the more libertarian classical liberal stance and the more socialist modern liberal stance. And obviously we've already gone over those and their essentially founding philosophers with John Locke and John Rawls. Bentham was also one of the fathers of political science, attempting to impose facts and figures into the realm of abstract, into politics. Tom Lehrer's sociology song comes to mind. Obviously that talks about when sociology was introduced as one of the social sciences, and it essentially mocks it for attempting to introduce numbers to make it seem more sciencey when there's not really a point, because it's not really a science. Obviously, it's in the realm of the abstract, as I've said there. Bentham supported democracy as he believed it was the best way to ensure legislation was informed by some sense of hedonic calculus. Bentham's opinions and youth. While John Stuart Mill's contributions to utilitarianism dominate the modern discussions on utilitarianism, Bentham remains a poignant example of an advocate of democracy who attempted to reconcile the dichotomy in liberalism between its support of democracy and its emphasis on individualism, as democracy is an inherently a system that prioritizes the collective over the individual. Bentham was a boy genius, and he read books from an early age. Bentham and Mill's transitional liberalism diverged from Lockean classical liberalism in the sense that Locke believed in a property qualification for the vote, while Bentham and Mill supported universal suffrage. And obviously, John Stuart Mill famously also supported women's suffrage because he introduced that, an amendment to the 1867 Reform Act, which would have enfranchised women. We'll get onto it when we do our lesson on the suffrage movement. So, Bentham was also a supporter of animal rights, and he and Mill advocated female suffrage, although it should be noted that women could technically vote prior to 1832. So, during the span of Jeremy Bentham's life, women had the vote, in theory. Obviously, a lot of them didn't, but they weren't prevented from voting from a parliamentary statute. It was more of a convention, but some women still voted. Bentham's opinions and strange life. Bentham's branch of utilitarianism is perceived to be rather Orwellian in the modern day, due to the fact that it was almost applied to reality with the construction of the panopticon, which was a prison building that would have all prisoners visible at all times, but only observed some of the time, so that the risk that you could be watched at any time would force a prisoner to behave in the desired way essentially all of the time. The panopticon was never built, but it adhered to the Hedonic Calculus, as it would supposedly bring about the greatest good to the greatest number, as crime within the prison would decrease. When Bentham died, he had his body preserved, and it is on display to this day, but it is pretty much a wax sculpture now with his bones inside. So obviously, after so long, he's starting to decay. He died in 1832, so it's nearly 200 years now. So, what is Hedonic Calculus? Hedonic Calculus stipulates that you must take these 7 factors into account before making a decision, so as to ensure the painful effects of the outcome will be balanced out by the pleasurable effects. And these 7 factors to consider are the intensity of an action, the duration of an action, the certainty of a particular outcome, remoteness, the extent, so essentially how far an action goes, the purity of an action, and the fecundity of an action. So that's how likely of one action leading to another. So that's essentially it for Hedonic Calculus. And now finally, let's take a look at utilitarianism and democracy. The utilitarians supported representative democracy, as representatives do not merely side with the majority of the governed, but they consider how the legislation will affect everyone in the society. So obviously, although it is commonly believed that utilitarianism is dominated by the tyranny of the majority, if a particular utilitarian believes hedonic calculus needs to be applied to everything, it would make sense for a representative democracy, because then you can have those people who understand the hedonic calculus making the decisions. Mill's proposition of developmental individualism, an individual striving to improve themselves via education. There's a good quote you can note down if you want. I believe he said, "It is better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a pig contented," which essentially this means it's better to suffer on your pursuit of knowledge than remain ignorant, because he does not believe that ignorance is bliss. He believed you were throwing away your future. And Mill also supported Bentham's utilitarianism, as Mill urged voters to take hedonic calculus into consideration when casting a vote to further avoid tyranny of the majority. As you can see, Mill and Bentham come up together a lot when you discuss both transitional liberalism and utilitarianism, which is why I'm probably going to add the lesson we did on John Stuart Mill to the playlist, and he'll essentially should be considered as one of these transitional liberals of the same type as Jeremy Bentham. You can call them either developmental liberals or transitional liberals. They essentially mean the same thing, and you won't be penalised for using one term over the other in an exam. So, that's it for Jeremy Bentham.